February 19th, 1945, Camp Aliceville, Alabama. The silence of the mess hall was broken only by the sharp, thin tearing of airmail paper. Ilsa watched Gretel, a girl of 19, trace the faint pencil marks on the letter, the smell of boiled potatoes and laundry soap, usually a neutral comfort, now felt heavy and artificial. Gretel's shoulders began to shake, a low keen escaping her throat before she slumped forward, her forehead hitting the smooth pine of the table. Ilsa moved instantly, her body shielding the younger woman from the WAC lieutenant standing near the door. The lieutenant shifted, her gaze falling on the posted Red Cross inspection notices, but she did not intervene. "She is just overwhelmed, Lieutenant," Ilsa said, her voice rough. "It is good news from home." Gretel's hand crushed the letter, the paper crackling in the sudden quiet. She was weeping not for joy, but for the words Ilsa had not yet read. "Berlin is gone. We have no food." Their stories, often lost to history, remind us of the complex truths of survival. We invite you to subscribe and share which country's hidden stories we should explore next. 8 weeks earlier, the arrival. The truck smelled of wet canvas, diesel exhaust, and the faint sour odor of fear. Ilsa kept her eyes fixed on the gray wooden slats of the bench opposite, counting the rivets. 1, 2, 3, 4. Beside her, Gretel was trembling, a vibration so slight it was more felt than seen, traveling from the girl's shoulder to Ilsa's arm. "Do not look weak," Ilsa murmured in German, her voice low, not turning her head. "Keep your chin level. They want us to be afraid." Gretel nodded, her pale knuckles white where she gripped the bench. She was 19, perhaps 20, captured near Aachen while serving as a Helferin, a signals auxiliary. Ilsa, a nurse with 20 years of field hospital experience, saw only a child who had forgotten the color of a proper meal. The truck stopped, its brakes hissing loudly in the damp air. "Rouse, out, move!" The voices were male, sharp, and accented, but not hysterical. They were efficient. They were herded from the truck bed onto wet, red clay that clung instantly to their worn boots, sucking at the soles. "Alabama," a guard had said at the rail station. To Ilsa, it felt like another planet. The air was heavy, humid, and carried an unfamiliar scent, not the sharp frost of the Ardennes, but something thick, green, and resinous. Pine trees, dense and dark, pressed in on the edges of the compound. They stood in a line, perhaps 30 women, shivering in the cold drizzle. Ilsa watched the American guards. They wore dark rain ponchos, their faces impassive under the hoods, rifles held downward. There was no shouting, no dogs straining at leashes, none of the brutal theater Dr. Goebbels had promised them. This methodical quiet was, in its own way, more unnerving. They were processed in a long wooden building that smelled strongly of lye soap, disinfectant, and damp wood. A medical check, cursory, but thorough. A stern-faced American nurse with tired eyes looked into Ilsa's throat, checked her scalp, and painted a cut on her hand with stinging, dark orange iodine. Then, the showers. Ilsa and Gretel stood together, the humiliation of the public nakedness eclipsed by the sudden, shocking heat of the water. It had been months. The water sluiced the grime of the transit camps from their skin, and for a moment, Ilsa closed her eyes, letting the impossible warmth sink into her bones. After, they were given clothing, dark green fatigue trousers, loose-fitting shirts, and sturdy shoes. The fabric was stiff, smelling overwhelmingly of laundry soap. They were marched to another building for assignment. A young woman in a different uniform, a WAC, Ilsa later learned, sat at a desk. She looked exhausted, but her movements were precise. She handed them each a small, folded bundle. Gretel fumbled, her hands stiff from cold and fear. The bundle dropped to the floor, unrolling slightly to reveal a wool blanket. Ilsa tensed, bracing for the inevitable reprimand, a shout, perhaps a blow. The WAC lieutenant merely sighed, a sound of impatience, not malice. She stood up, walked around the desk, and picked up the blanket. She did not throw it at Gretel. She folded it once, neatly, and pressed it into the younger woman's arms. "It's dry," the American said, her voice flat, not unkind. "You'll be in Barrack C. Get some sleep." Ilsa stared. The blanket was thick, gray with a dark stripe. It was clean. It was warm. Gretel buried her face in the wool, a choked sob catching in her throat. Ilsa pulled her close, her hand firm on the back of Gretel's neck. "We are all right," she whispered, the words feeling foreign and untrue. They were led through the darkness to Barracks C. It was clean. It was empty. The cots were lined up, each with a thin mattress. Ilsa and Gretel took 2 cots in the corner, spreading their new blankets. The fear had not gone. It had merely changed shape. The expected brutality had been replaced by this sterile, organized efficiency. Ilsa lay awake, listening to the rain on the roof and the quiet, terrified breathing of the other women. Tomorrow, they would face the true test. Tomorrow would be the first meal. A loud metallic bell jolted Ilsa from a shallow, restless sleep. It was still dark, the windows of Barrack C showing only gray rectangles against the black. Women stirred, the sounds of nervous coughing and the rustle of stiff clothing filling the space. Gretel sat up, her eyes wide with the familiar animalistic fear of the newly captured. "Stay with me," Ilsa said, her voice rough with sleep. "Do not speak unless spoken to. Watch what I do." They were marched in 2 orderly lines through the pre-dawn chill. The red clay mud was thicker now, slick from the night's rain. Ilsa focused on the back of the woman in front of her, ignoring the WC guards walking parallel to the line, their footsteps precise and measured. The mess hall was another long wooden building, identical to the barracks, but brightly lit. The light spilled from the windows, warm and yellow, cutting into the blue-gray mist of the morning. As they neared the doors, a smell reached them. It was not the thin, acrid smell of burnt barley or watery cabbage soup. It was the unmistakable, complex aroma of roasting meat and strong, real coffee. Ilsa's stomach clenched. A trick. It had to be. They filed inside. The room was vast, filled with long pine tables and painfully clean. It smelled of bleach, coffee, and the heavy scent of beef stew. Behind a long metal counter, servers, other POWs, Ilsa noted, wearing white aprons, ladled food onto metal trays. Ilsa and Gretel shuffled forward in the line. Ilsa had prepared herself for watery gruel, a heel of stale bread, perhaps weak hot water. It was what prisoners received. It was the logic of war. She reached the counter. A server, a woman Ilsa did not recognize, silently scooped a large ladle of thick stew onto the tray. Ilsa saw chunks of dark beef, carrots, and onions. Next, a scoop of mashed potatoes. Then, 2 slices of thick, shockingly white bread. At the end, a WC guard pushed a heavy ceramic mug under a metal spigot. Dark, steaming coffee splashed into it. Ilsa stared at the tray. It was heavy. The food was hot. It was more food than she had seen in one place in 3 years. "Move along," the WAC said, not unkindly. Ilsa picked up the tray, her hands unsteady. This was a performance. Perhaps the Red Cross was here. Perhaps they were being filmed. She found a spot at a table near the back, Gretel sliding in beside her. The entire hall was silent, save for the metallic clinking of spoons and forks against the trays. No one spoke. The women ate with a desperate, fearful focus, their eyes down, as if expecting the food to be snatched away. Ilsa saw Elsbeth, a woman from Berlin, look around wildly. Elsbeth then quickly, expertly, wrapped one of her slices of bread in a paper napkin and shoved it deep into the pocket of her fatigue trousers. She looked up, met Ilse's eyes, and then looked away, ashamed but defiant. Ilse understood perfectly. Elsbeth was hoarding. She was acting on the only logic she knew. This abundance was temporary. Tomorrow, the starvation would surely begin. "Eat!" Ilse whispered to Gretel, who was only pushing the potatoes around. Ilse dipped her own spoon into the stew. She brought it to her lips, half expecting the taste of poison or chemicals. She tasted beef, salt, thyme. It was simple, barracks food, but it was real. She took a bite of the bread. It was soft and tasteless, not the hearty rye she missed, but it was filling. She drank the coffee. It was scalding, bitter, and undeniably real. They ate everything. When they were finished, they stacked their trays as instructed and filed back out into the morning, which was now a pale, watery gray. The food sat heavy in Ilse's stomach, a warm, confusing lump. There had been no trick, no cameras, no inspectors. They had been fed. Ilse felt a profound sense of disorientation. The Americans were following the rules. This simple, bureaucratic act of providing adequate calories felt more destabilizing than any brutality. It made no sense. The routine of the previous day repeated, but the fear had shifted. The sharp, immediate terror of violence had been replaced by a dull, chronic suspicion. The bell rang in the dark. They dressed in silence. They marched over the same red clay, which was already beginning to dry under a surprisingly bright, cool sun. The mess hall smelled different. The heavy, savory scent of beef stew was gone, replaced by the sharp, invigorating aroma of coffee and something else, yeast and toasted grain. They filed past the counter, holding the same metal trays. This time, the servers, other German women, their faces now familiar but still closed, placed 2 thick slices of toast, a small ladle of scrambled eggs, and a small white paper cup of apple jelly. Then Ilse saw it. At the end of the line, next to the coffee urns, was a large metal bowl filled with ice. Resting on the ice were dozens of small, perfectly square pats of something pale yellow, each wrapped in waxed paper. Ilse's line of thought halted. It could not be. It was margarine, of course. Perhaps axle grease, repackaged. It was a prop, another part of this strange American play. She watched the woman in front of her pick one up. Gretel reached the bowl. Her hand hovered over the ice. She looked back at Ilse, her eyes wide, asking a silent question. Ilse gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Take what they offer. Do not make a scene. Gretel picked up one of the small squares. It was cold in her hand. She and Ilse found their seats at the long pine table. Around them, the same ritual of silence was unfolding. But today, the silence was focused on the small, waxed paper squares. Ilse watched as Elsbeth, the woman who had hoarded bread the day before, carefully unwrapped hers. Ilse turned to her own. She tore the paper, her fingers feeling clumsy. Inside was a perfect firm pat of pale butter. She smelled it. It was clean, creamy, and slightly salty. It was not margarine. It was not the schmaltz rendered from scraps, nor the ersatz chemical spreads they had endured for years in Hamburg. It was butter. She looked at Gretel. The girl was staring at the butter as if it were a religious artifact. She had placed it on her toast, but she had not taken a bite. The heat from the bread was already softening the edges, a tiny golden pool melting onto the white surface. Gretel, Ilse said, her voice quiet but firm. Eat. Gretel looked at her, and for the first time, Ilse saw not fear, but a deep, agonizing confusion. The girl's lower lip trembled. My little brother, Gretel whispered, her voice cracking. Back home. He's not tasted butter in 3, perhaps 4 years. He asked our mother. He asked if he would get butter for his birthday. She was not looking at Ilse, but at the melting gold on her toast. "He thinks it is the color of the sun." Ilse had no answer. She looked down at her own tray. The eggs were fluffy, the coffee was hot, and the butter was real. She remembered her sister's last letter, written 6 months ago, describing the triumphant purchase of a single kilogram of turnips on the black market. A wave of dizziness, sharp and sudden, washed over Ilse. This was not kindness. It was a different kind of weapon. Brutality she could understand. Starvation she could fight. But this calculated, casual abundance, it was obscene. She picked up her toast. She forced herself to take a bite. The butter was rich, fatty, and delicious. It tasted, she thought, exactly like guilt. The days settled into a strange, monotonous rhythm, dictated not by gunfire, but by bells. The bell for waking, the bell for morning roll call, the bell for meals, the bell for work, the bell for lights out. The fear of immediate violence had evaporated, leaving behind a vacuum filled with routine and a profound, surreal boredom. Ilse and Gretel, along with most of the women from their barracks, were assigned to the laundry and sewing rooms. It was work, but it was not labor. It was indoors, away from the unpredictable Alabama weather. Ilse, with her nurse's precision, was put in charge of mending uniforms. Gretel, younger and quicker, was assigned to one of the pedal-operated sewing machines. For this, the camp administration paid them. At the end of the week, a WAC lieutenant would come by with a metal box and hand each woman a few small paper-script coupons, redeemable at the camp canteen for small luxuries: soap, a comb, writing paper, or even American cigarettes. Ilse refused the cigarettes, but she used the script to buy a bar of lye soap for Gretel, whose skin had broken out from the harsh laundry detergent. It was another layer of absurdity, being paid, however meagerly, by the enemy to mend the enemy's clothes. But the most significant, most unsettling change was not the routine. It was physical. The dread of the first few days, the suspicion of the food, the hoarding of bread, had faded. The food kept coming. There was meat or stew every day. There were potatoes, bread, vegetables from the camp's own garden, and coffee. And always, at breakfast, there was the small, symbolic pat of yellow butter. They ate. Their bodies, starved for years, responded with a desperate, greedy efficiency. The change in Gretel was the most pronounced. The girl's skin, once a pale, translucent gray, took on a healthier sheen. The hollows under her eyes and at her temples began to fill out. The constant, rasping cough that had plagued her since the transit camp disappeared. She no longer looked like a hunted animal. She looked, Ilse thought with a pang, like a Mädchen again, a simple German girl. Ilse felt it in herself too. The gnawing ache of hunger that had been her constant companion for 2 years was gone. She slept through the night, a deep, heavy sleep she had forgotten was possible. One evening, after their shift, Ilse was mending a tear in her own fatigue trousers. The fabric was coarse and stiff. She pulled the needle through, and as she pulled the trousers taut over her thigh, she noticed the seam. It was straining. The waistband, which had been loose just a few weeks prior, now sat snugly, almost tightly, against her hips. She stopped, the needle poised in her hand. She looked across the barracks. Gretel was sitting on her cot, brushing her hair with a comb Ilse had bought. The girl's face was turned in profile. Her cheeks were no longer sunken. They were round. A cold, sickening realization washed over Ilse. It started in her stomach, the very place that was now so comfortably, reliably full. Wir werden fettleibig. We are getting fatter. The thought was grotesque. It was shameful. Back home in Hamburg, her sister was bartering family heirlooms for sacks of rotting potatoes. In Berlin, The radio broadcasts they were sometimes allowed to hear spoke of heroic sacrifice and tightening belts. Here, in the heart of the enemy, they were gaining weight. The yellow butter at breakfast, the thick stew at dinner, the absence of bombs, it was not just sustenance, it was insulation. It was fattening them, separating them pound by pound, calorie by calorie, from the suffering of their own people. Ilsa put down the sewing, her hands suddenly cold. The comfort of her own body felt like a betrayal. In the middle of February 1945, a new rumor swept through Barrack C. It was not a rumor of impending liberation, nor of harsher treatment. It was a rumor of mail. The International Red Cross, the women whispered over the sewing machines and in the laundry, had completed a delivery. A shipment of letters from home, letters written months ago, letters that had crossed a war-torn ocean, had arrived in Alabama. For Ilsa, the news extinguished all the mundane comforts of the camp. The routine, the work, the absence of hunger, all of it dissolved. The physical safety they had achieved now seemed a cruel mockery, a waiting room for a verdict. Her mind, which she had disciplined to focus on mending seams and counting rations, now flew uncontrollably back to Hamburg. She saw her sister, Anna, trying to keep her children safe in the cellar, the sky raining fire. She remembered the faces in the hospital, the smell of phosphorus, the endless, screaming sirens. Ilsa? Gretel's voice pulled her back. They were sitting on their cots after the evening meal. Gretel was holding a small notebook she had purchased with her canteen script, but she was not writing. She was just staring at the blank page. Do you think we will hear? Perhaps, Ilsa said, her voice more brusque than she intended. Do not hope too much. It is a long way. But they said the mail is here, at the administration building. Ilsa nodded, unable to offer the girl any real comfort. What comfort was there? Good news was impossible. The best they could hope for was proof of life. The best they could hope for was that their families were only starving, only cold, and not buried beneath the rubble of a 1,000-bomber raid. For 2 days, the tension in the barracks was unbearable. The women snapped at each other over small things, a borrowed comb, a spilled cup of water. The sewing machines clattered with a frantic, angry energy. Even the food, the very source of their confusing health, lost its taste. The yellow butter at breakfast seemed particularly repulsive, a waxy, insolent reminder of their privilege. On the afternoon of the third day, the work bell rang as usual. They filed back to Barrack C, the low gray sky threatening more rain. They had just begun to strip off their damp outer shirts when the door opened without a knock. Every woman froze. It was the WAS lieutenant from the intake, the one who had given Gretel the blanket. She was accompanied by a young corporal, and in her hand, she held not a rifle, but a simple clipboard. The corporal carried a canvas mailbag. The lieutenant stepped into the center of the room. The air was thick, silent. Ilsa could hear the sound of a single drop of water falling from the leaky roof into a pail. "I have mail," the lieutenant said, her American voice cutting through the German silence. She did not look up from her clipboard. She simply began to read names in alphabetical order. Bauer, Helga. A woman near the door gasped and stepped forward. Dietrich, Marlene. Fuchs, Elsbeth. Ilsa held her breath. Her heart was a cold, hard knot in her chest. She watched Elsbeth, the bread hoarder, take the thin, flimsy airmail letter, her hand shaking violently. Hartmann Ilsa. The name hung in the air. Ilsa felt Gretel's hand snatch at her sleeve. She could not move. Hartmann, Ilsa, the lieutenant repeated, looking up, her gaze scanning the room. Here, Ilsa managed to say. Her voice was a croak. She forced her legs to move, walking past the rows of cots. The lieutenant handed her the letter. It was impossibly light, almost weightless. It was addressed to her in her sister Anna's familiar slanted handwriting. Across the top, a thick red stamp, geprüft, inspected. She turned. Schmidt, Gretel. Gretel let out a small, strangled cry. She stumbled forward, taking her own letter from the lieutenant's hand. The lieutenant read 3 more names, then nodded to the corporal. That is all for C Barracks. And then they were gone. The room was filled with the sound of tearing paper, sharp and violent, followed by a new, terrible silence. Ilse stared at the letter in her hand, her name and prisoner number written clearly on the front. She wanted to open it. She wanted to burn it. Ilse's fingers were numb. She stood by her cot, the thin airmail letter feeling heavy as stone. Around her, the barracks was a cacophony of small, sharp sounds, the tearing of paper, sudden inhalations, and then silence, followed by the first muffled sobs. Gretel had already stumbled to the small wooden table in the center of the barracks, her own letter spread flat. Ilse forced her thumb under the flap. The paper was thin, gray, and covered in Anna's spidery, precise script. It was dated. December 1944. 2 months. It had taken 2 months for this news to find her. My dearest Ilse, it began, we pray you are safe. We are managing. The city is different, but we are strong. The children ask for you. Ilse read the words, her mind struggling to form images. The polite, strained cheerfulness was a code she knew well. It was the language of the home front, the language of pretending. She scanned the lines, searching for the truth beneath the pleasantries. Her eyes caught a name. Dresden. Your cousins in Dresden. You must pray for them. We have not heard since the attacks. The news that gets through is unspeakable. They call it a Feuersturm. We fear the worst. Ilse's breath caught. She read on. The tone of the letter shifted. The forced cheerfulness cracked, and the raw, desperate truth spilled out. The ration cards are nearly worthless. There is no coal. The children have not seen milk since September. We search for potato peels in the rubbish bins behind the Wehrmacht barracks. They boil well enough. Do not worry. We are managing, but Otto. Ilse's vision blurred. Otto, her brother-in-law. Otto was in the cellar when the last raid hit Berlin. The building collapsed. He is gone. Anna is with us now. She does not speak. A metallic ringing started in Ilse's ears. She looked at the words, potato peels in the rubbish bins. Her mind flashed, unwanted to breakfast. The thick, white bread, the scrambled eggs, the small, perfect yellow pat of butter melting into the toast, the feeling of a full stomach, the shame of her straining waistband. Wir werden fett, Liebig. We are getting fatter. A sound, a low keen, cut through her thoughts. It was Gretel. The girl was slumped forward, her head on the table. Her shoulders were shaking, a deep, rattling sob that seemed too large for her small body. Ilse moved, her nurse's instincts taking over, pushing her own grief down. She reached the table just as Gretel's hand clenched, crushing her own letter into a tight, damp ball. The door to the barracks was still open. The WAC lieutenant, the one who had delivered the mail, was standing there, watching. Her face was unreadable in the gray light. Ilse moved instantly, her body shielding the younger woman from the American's view. The lieutenant shifted, her gaze falling on the posted Red Cross inspection notices tacked to the wall, as if reminding herself of the rules. She did not intervene. She is just overwhelmed, Lieutenant, Ilse said. Her voice was a harsh rasp. She had to force the words out. It is good news from home. The lie hung in the air, thick and toxic. Gretel wept, her face hidden, her hand still crushing the news of a home that no longer existed. From the direction of the mess hall, Ilse could smell the evening meal being prepared. The heavy, earthy smell of boiled potatoes. It was a smell that had, for weeks, meant safety. Now, it was the smell of obscene surplus. It was the smell of their survival. Ilse put her hand on Gretel's shaking back, her own letter clutched tight in her fist. The truth was finally, horribly clear. They were not the victims. They were the prisoners, and they were the ones who were safe. An hour later, the bell rang for the evening meal. The sound which had once signaled relief and an end to hunger now felt like a summons to a trial. The women of Barrack C moved like automatons, their faces gray and slack with shock. They formed their lines, but the usual nervous chatter was gone. There was only the sound of boots shuffling through the mud and the rhythmic, indifferent clang of the bell. Ilse held Gretel's arm, guiding the girl, who seemed to be walking in her sleep. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face puffy and pale. The mess hall was brightly lit, as always. It was warm. The scent of food, tonight it was potato soup, baked ham, and canned corn, hit Ilse like a physical blow. The smell of the hot potatoes, so similar to the ones her sister was boiling from garbage peels, made her stomach heave. They moved down the line. A server dropped a slice of ham onto Ilse's metal tray. Another added a scoop of bright, steaming yellow corn. A small pat of butter had been placed on the corn, where it was already beginning to melt, creating a rich, golden pool. Ilse stared at the butter. It was the color of infection. It was the color of surplus. She and Gretel found their usual table. The room was full, but the silence was profound. It was not the fearful silence of their first meal. It was a heavy, suffocating silence of shared grief. The only sounds were the scrape of a bench, the click of a spoon against a tray. Sounds that seemed amplified, almost obscene in the absence of human voices. Ilse looked at Gretel. The girl was sitting perfectly still, her hands in her lap, staring at the food. She had not picked up her spoon. "Gretel," Ilse said softly. The girl did not respond. "Gretel, you must eat." Gretel turned her head slowly and looked at Ilse. Her eyes were empty. "They are eating potato peels," she whispered. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "From the rubbish, my mother, my brother. Potato peels." "I know," Ilse said, her own voice thick. "I know." "I cannot." Gretel turned back to the tray. "It is a sin." Ilse looked around the hall. Elsbeth was crying silently into her hands, her own tray untouched. Two other women were simply staring at the wall. A cold resolve hardened in Ilse. She picked up Gretel's spoon, dipped it into the soup, and held it to the girl's lips. "Eat!" Gretel recoiled. "No, please." "Eat," Ilse commanded, her voice suddenly harsh. "Do you think your mother is starving so that you can starve here? Do you think she would want you to die of grief? We do not have that luxury." Gretel flinched, as if Ilse had struck her. A single tear rolled down her cheek. "You must live," Ilse whispered, her voice breaking. "Living it is the only thing we have." Is survival our only revenge? Ilse thought, her mind a swirl of confusion. Or is it our ultimate betrayal? Slowly, like a wounded animal, Gretel opened her mouth. Ilse fed her the spoonful of soup, then another. Ilse then turned to her own tray. She picked up her own spoon. She forced herself to eat the corn, the sickeningly sweet taste of the butter coating her tongue. She ate the ham. She ate the soup. Each bite was an act of violence, a confirmation of her own obscene safety. She watched Elsbeth. The woman, her face a mask of misery, picked up her slice of bread, but she did not eat it. She looked around, making sure no guards were watching. Then, just as she had done on the first day out of fear, she wrapped the bread in her napkin. This time, however, she hid it not to save for later, but to dispose of. She could not eat it, but she could not bear to throw it in the designated waste bins where the Americans would see the food returned. It was an act of shame. Ilsa saw two other women do the same. The survivors were hoarding again, only this time they were hoarding their guilt. The atmosphere in the camp soured. The silent, collective grief of Barracks C had practical, visible consequences. Food was being returned. Trays were left half-eaten. Women, including Gretel, reported to the infirmary complaining of nausea and headaches, victims of the sudden, sickening clash between their recovering bodies and their traumatized minds. The American guards, who had previously maintained a professional, detached efficiency, now watched them with a new expression, a cold, confused suspicion. To the WACs, this was not grief. It was ingratitude. It was a protest. It was the arrogance of the Herrenvolk refusing the very food that had saved them. The guards' voices became sharper. Roll call inspections became more meticulous. The fragile, unspoken truce of the routine was broken. Ilsa saw the change in the Wasi lieutenant who oversaw the sewing room. The woman, who had once offered Gretel the blanket, now stalked the aisles between the clattering machines, her eyes missing nothing. She would pause behind women who had been weeping, watching their hands shake as they tried to guide the fabric. One afternoon, the lieutenant summoned Ilsa to the small office at the front of the room. Ilsa's stomach tightened. She expected to be reprimanded, perhaps punished, for the barracks' behavior. The lieutenant was sitting at her desk, a cup of steaming coffee beside her. She pointed to a chair. "Sit down, Hartman." Ilsa sat, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap. The lieutenant pushed a folded piece of newsprint across the desk. It was from a local paper, the Aliceville Picayune. "You are a smart woman, Ilsa," the lieutenant said, her voice low, not angry, but weary. "You understand more English than you let on. I want you to read this." She pointed to a column marked editorial. Ilsa unfolded the paper. The ink was dark and smeared slightly. The headline was stark. "Our boys starve. Enemy prisoners get butter?" Ilsa read the first few sentences, her English serviceable enough to catch the meaning. The writer, a local woman, was incensed. Her son was fighting in Europe, surviving on K-rations. Her daughter, in Birmingham, could not find real butter or sugar for her children because of rationing. And yet, she wrote, the Nazi women at the camp were being coddled, fed 3 hot meals a day, given medical care, and paid for their work. "It is a moral failing," Ilsa read, "that our own families must sacrifice while the enemy who caused this war grows fat on American generosity." Ilsa put the newspaper down, her hands steady. She looked at the lieutenant. "They think," Ilsa said, her voice a dry rasp, "that we are grateful for this." The lieutenant leaned back, crossing her arms. "The people in this town, their sons are dying. They read the same letters you do, Ilsa. But their letters are from the other side. They do not understand why you are throwing food in the garbage." A strange, hysterical laugh threatened to bubble up in Ilsa's throat. She suppressed it. It was a theater of the absurd. They were trapped between two worlds, both of which saw them as villains. Their families in Berlin saw them as traitors, living in safety. The Americans in Aliceville saw them as arrogant monsters, wasting precious butter. "They do not understand," Ilsa said quietly, looking at the newspaper. "And you do not understand. And we do not understand either." The lieutenant sighed, picking up the paper. "I do not care if you understand, Hartman. I care about regulations. This behavior stops. You will eat the food. You will do the work. The war is not over for you." Ilsa stood up. She looked at the lieutenant, seeing not an enemy, but another woman trapped in a role she did not fully comprehend. "Yes, Lieutenant, She walked back to her sewing machine. The realization settled on her, cold and heavy as lead. There was no moral high ground. There was no one to appeal to. They were hated by the locals for the food they ate, and they were haunted by their families for the same reason. They were utterly, completely alone. The guilt was useless. Wasting away was not an option. It was an insult. If her survival was an obscenity, she decided, then she would make it a purposeful one. The encounter with the lieutenant and the editorial had changed something in Ilsa. The passive, suffocating guilt of the past few days now hardened into a desperate, illogical need for action. If her survival was an offense, she would try to mitigate it. If she was receiving this food, she would try to redirect it. Her plan was simple, naive, and utterly essential. The next morning at breakfast, she did not eat her pat of butter. She slipped the small, waxed paper square into her trouser pocket. She did the same with the small paper packet of sugar provided for her coffee. When she reported for work at the sewing room, she walked directly to the lieutenant's office at the front. The door was open. The lieutenant was at her desk, reviewing a stack of logbooks. "Lieutenant," Ilsa said, standing in the doorway. The WAC looked up, her eyes tired. "What is it, Hartman?" "I request permission to speak with you. Officially." The lieutenant frowned, surprised by the formality. She gestured to the chair. "Come in. Close the door." Ilsa entered the small, clean office. It smelled of coffee and mimeograph ink. A stack of outgoing censored letters sat in a wooden tray on the corner of the desk, waiting for the mail courier. Ilsa sat, her back rigid. "Well?" "Lieutenant," Ilsa began, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I have a request. It is a practical matter." She reached into her pocket and placed the small pat of butter and the packet of sugar on the lieutenant's desk, next to the logbooks. The butter, warmed by her body, was already soft, the paper wrapper translucent with grease. "I do not require this," Ilsa said. My family in Berlin, they have nothing. I request that my ration of butter and sugar be sent to them, at my expense. You can deduct the cost of postage from my canteen script." The lieutenant stared at the small, melting offering on her desk. She did not look angry. She did not look amused. For a long moment, she simply looked sad. She sighed, a long, weary exhalation, and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Hartman," she said, her voice dropping the sharp, official tone. "Ilsa, I cannot do that." "I have the money for postage," Ilsa insisted, misunderstanding. "It is not about the money." The lieutenant leaned forward. "First, it is logistically impossible. We cannot send packages into a war zone. We cannot guarantee a letter arrives, let alone a parcel of food. It would be confiscated or rot before it ever left this state." Ilsa opened her mouth to argue, but the lieutenant held up a hand. "Second, and this is the important part, your rations are not a gift. They are not a privilege. They are a regulation. They are dictated by the Geneva Convention, Article 11. My government has agreed to feed you a commensurate diet. I am required by international treaty and military law to provide you with this food." "But it is my food," Ilsa whispered. "I wish to give it away." "It is not your food until you have eaten it," the lieutenant said, her voice firming again. "I cannot allow you to starve yourself. I cannot allow you to refuse your rations. That, too, is against the rules. We are not in the business of punishment, Hartman. We are in the business of containment." She picked up the pat of butter, the paper yielding under her fingers, and handed it back to Ilsa. "I know. I am aware of the news you received. The censors read your mail. We all know what is happening over there." Her gaze softened just for a second. "There is nothing you can do for your family from here. Nothing. Your only job, your only duty right now is to survive. That is the rule. Survive. Do you understand me?" Ilsa looked at the melting butter in her own hand. It was the ultimate rejection. She was being denied even the right to her own symbolic sacrifice. She was being ordered to live, to be healthy, to endure this obscene safety. She closed her hand around the butter, the greasy paper crinkling. "Yes, Lieutenant," she said, her voice hollow. "Good. Go back to your work." Ilsa stood, turned, and walked out of the office, the small, useless gift still crushed in her fist. There would be no easy absolution. Ilsa walked back to Barrack C, the soft, greasy packet of butter still clutched in her hand. She felt hollowed out, scoured clean of hope. The lieutenant's refusal, so logical and bureaucratic, had removed her last, desperate option for atonement. She was cornered by an unyielding policy of mandated survival. She sat on her cot. Gretel was asleep, her breathing shallow, her face still streaked with the salt of dried tears. Ilsa looked at the girl, this child she had tried to shield. Wasting away in grief would not save Gretel. It would not rebuild Dresden. It would not bring Otto back. Slowly, Ilsa unfolded the waxed paper. The butter was a misshapen, lukewarm mess. She looked at it for a long time. Then, with a deliberate, almost violent motion, she scraped it off the paper with her finger and ate it. It was a conscious act, a declaration. If she was being forced to live, she would live. She would not give them the satisfaction of her decline. Weeks blurred. March turned to April. The work continued. The meals arrived, were eaten. The letters from home stopped entirely, the Red Cross unable to penetrate the chaos of a collapsing Reich. In the absence of news, a thick, stagnant quiet settled over the camp. Then, in the second week of May, the WAC lieutenant assembled all of Barrack C outside for a special roll call. The spring air was warm, smelling of pine and damp earth. "I have an announcement," the lieutenant said, her voice formal. "As of 800 yesterday, May 8th, 1945, all German forces in Europe have surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is over." There was no cheering, no gasps of relief. There was only a profound, stunned silence. It was over. The thing that had defined their entire existence, the engine of their suffering, and the cause of their imprisonment, was finished. Gretel swayed, and Ilsa caught her arm. The girl looked at her, her eyes wide with a new, terrifying question. What happens now? Ilsa did not know. They were no longer enemy prisoners of war. But they were not free. They were just survivors, detained indefinitely. That evening, Ilsa used her canteen script to buy a pencil and a thin sheaf of writing paper. She sat on her cot, the sounds of the barracks, women quietly weeping, others arguing in low, angry tones, fading into the background. She began to write a new letter to her sister, Anna. She knew with a chilling certainty that this letter would not be sent for months, perhaps even a year. It did not matter. This was not for the censors or for the Red Cross. This was for herself. "My dearest Anna," she wrote. She paused, the pencil heavy in her hand. She thought of the ham, the eggs, the butter. She thought of the potato peels. She set those images aside. They were useless. "I am alive. I am healthy. I am working, and I am learning English from one of the guards. Do not despair. The day we are allowed to return, I will come home. I will find you. I am a nurse. We will rebuild the children's ward at the hospital. We will rebuild everything. Wait for me. I am strong. I will come home." She folded the letter and tucked it inside her mattress. She would eat their food. She would take their calories, their protein, their fats, and she would convert them into strength. She would learn their language. She would study their methods, Her survival would no longer be a passive, shameful secret. It would be an act of deliberate, patient resolve. She would carry not only her own story, but the stories of Gretel and Elsbeth and the women who had wept over the letters from home. She sat with Gretel on the barrack steps, watching the sun set over the Alabama pines. The future was a vast, terrifying blank. But for the first time since her capture, Ilsa looked into the darkness, and she was not afraid. She was preparing.